Okay, moving on to present, middle, or passive indicative verb forms. At the bottom of 17, the textbook notes that the passive voice of Greek verbs expresses the same meaning as the English passive voice. It represents the subject as being acted on rather than performing the action. Thus, the passive of I am loosing is I am being loosed. Turning to page 18, at the top, the middle voice, Greek verbs can also be in the middle voice, a voice that really has no English equivalent. The middle voice represents the subject as acting for itself or in its own interest. Now that's a crucial statement. You need to highlight that in your book. The middle voice represents the subject as acting for itself or in its own interest. It's translated by adding the words for myself or for yourself after the normal active translation. So the present middle indicative first person singular of I loose is I am loosing for myself. Okay. So I've highlighted here on the screen the fact that the middle voice is relatively infrequent in the New Testament. In fact, William Mounce has estimated that as high as 70% of the middle passive forms in the New Testament are not actually middle passive in meaning. So maybe about 30% of the forms. So it's fairly rare. But you need to know it because it shows up in some important places. All right. Moving on to primary middle passive endings, as you learned in Lesson 3, the present tense uses primary endings, and the present middle passive indicative uses the primary middle or passive endings. So let's just go back to our Greek verb map for a minute. If you remember, we are in the primary tenses here, and we're working with the present, and last lesson we learned the active voice endings. And the primary active verb endings are o, is, e, omen, ete, usi. And now we're going to learn the middle passive voice endings. And those endings are me, se, te, metha, estha, nta. Again, me, se, te, metha, estha, nta. The eta iota subscript in parentheses after the se is there because most of the time this se ending contracts to an eta iota subscript, which would be pronounced a. We'll see that in just a minute. So this is where we are on the Greek verb map. We're looking at the primary tenses. We've already seen the active voice. Now we're looking at the middle passive voice. And the textbook gives you the endings there. Me, se, te. I keep saying that wrong because the Erasmian pronunciation is mai, sai, tai. Metha, estha, ntai. The reconstructed cune, me, se, te, metha, estha, nta. Now, the textbook notes that connecting vowels occur in the primary middle passive indicative. Now, from one point of view, you've been experiencing connecting vowels for a whole semester. On the other hand, you didn't realize that they were connecting vowels. So what this is doing is making explicit to you what you've already experienced to some degree. Specifically, a connecting vowel occurs between the stem of the verb, with luo, the stem is lu, and the ending. The connecting vowel has no meaning. It simply eases the pronunciation of the verb stem with an ending that begins with a consonant. Not every tense inserts connecting vowels, so that's important. It says those that do must be memorized. I'm not going to have you memorize those. What I do want you to know is that the connecting vowel will always be an omicron if the ending begins with a mu or a nu, or an epsilon if the ending begins with any other consonant. So as you look at these endings up here, me begins with a mu, so its connecting vowel is omicron. Se begins with a sigma, so it will be epsilon. Tav is not a mu or a nu, so it's epsilon. Here we'll have an omicron, so ometha. have an epsilon because we don't have a mu or a nu, and here we'll have an omicron because it begins with a nu. So these are the three places where the omicron connecting vowel will be used with middle passive, primary middle passive endings. The next section gives you the forms of the present middle passive indicative of luo. Okay, so here you see over here on this side, the first person singular, second and third. The stem is lu, the connecting vowel is omicron, and the ending is me, lu o me, which if you translate it passively would be translated I am being loosed. If you translate it as a middle, I'm loosing for myself. You say, well, how do you tell the difference between passive and middle? The answer is always context. Ambiguity is to be resolved by context. So that's lu o me, lue, you are being loosed, you are loosing for yourself, and luete, luete. Now, I've cut off of the next page this statement. Be aware that though lue is the second person singular form of luo, the actual ending is se. The sigma has dropped out, and the connecting vowel epsilon contracts with the alpha iota of the ending to form eta iota subscript. If you wanted to see the rules of contraction, you can look at Lesson 9. This is not so crucial because you will only ever see the present middle passive indicative second person singular verb forms having an eta iota subscript. They will never show up with a sigma alpha iota. So, but there's a reason for wanting you to know that that second singular ending is sigma alpha iota, because in the perfect tense, where there are no connecting vowels, that ending will be sigma alpha iota and will not contract to an eta iota subscript. So those are the singular forms. Here are the plural forms. Luomatha, we are being loosed. Luestha, you are being loosed. Luante, they are being loosed. And I've put them together here on this slide so that you can see them all in one place, the singular and the plural forms. Luoma, lue, luete, luomatha, luestha, luonde. And that's it for present middle passive indicative verb forms. And we'll work on practicing these in class. The vocabulary for this lesson gives you some additional information that you need to be aware of. You already know the word gar means for. In our song with Zacchaeus, in gar to yuko su di me mine, for I'm going to your house, I'm going to remain in your house today. Gar is a post-positive. That's the technical grammatical term we use, as footnote 11 says, to indicate a word that can never be first in a sentence in Greek, but it will almost always be translated first in English. So, in gar to yuko, literally in for the house, but in English we turn that around and say for in the house. De is also a postpositive. So when you see gar or de, what you need to do is back up in the Greek sentence one word, at least one, maybe two, and realize that, okay, the sentence started just before de or gar. I will put the de or gar in my English sentence first and then translate the rest of the sentence. A few other things to point out here in the vocabulary. With the preposition in, the with the dative in parentheses lets you know that it requires its object to be in the dative case. And upo is our first example of a preposition that has two meanings based on the object it's followed by. So if upo is followed with a genitive, it means by. If it's followed with an accusative noun, it means under. All right, so that means you have to listen or pay attention as you're reading to the case of the object after the preposition. So for example, with the preposition upo, if you want to say by the Lord, you say upo tu kuriu, placing Lord in the genitive case, upo tu kuriu. If you want to say under the Lord, you say upo ton kurion, upo ton kurion, placing Lord in the accusative case. So with prepositions that have more than one meaning, you pay attention to the case of its object to determine the meaning intended by the author. Just a little bit more. I'd mentioned gar and des postpositives. There's one other postpositive learning in this lesson, un, meaning then or therefore. I encourage you to pay attention to the articles at the end of the nouns as you are learning your vocab. Doulos is masculine, so it has the masculine article. Ergon, hieron, semion, and teknon are all neuter, so they have the neuter articles after them. Ochlos is masculine. All right, that's it for lesson 4. See you in class.